Welcome to the PolyPsych podcast. This is your host, Anthony Lindsay.
And Stephanie Moreno.
All right, we're here with DeDe Wohlfarth and Truman Harris at Spalding University. The first question I want to ask you is, we did a podcast on microaggressions. So can you shed some light on what microaggressions are and some of the institutional obstacles that minorities face?
Well, in terms of microaggressions, like the research is kind of mixed in terms of what they actually are. But Sue, in 2017, he actually has a pretty decent definition of what microaggressions are. They're assumed to be unintentional, but the thing is, some of them actually are pretty intentional. So, the actual definition is this.
It's unintentional slights or put downs or invalidations against groups that are marginalized. And so really what you get, Anthony and Stephanie, you really get, like, racism tends to be more intentional, but microaggressions are usually more unintentional. People don't mean to say mean things to other groups, but because we live in such a racist and sexist and heterosexist society, we often say those things. We don't mean to, but we do.
Would you say that they're fueled by the stereotypes?
Oh, absolutely. And here's the challenge, is that everybody has stereotypes. Stereotypes are just normal, right?
Yeah.
So we all have stereotypes because our brains are just trying to work really efficiently. Mm-hmm. So we all are full of stereotypes, right? You can't not be. Stereotypes are just your brain's way of trying to chunk large pieces of information quickly. So we all have these stereotypes, and that's the problem is not our stereotypes. The problem is that we deny our stereotypes, and the problem is that we use our stereotypes to limit access to resources for some groups of people.
So the way I've seen them is that the microaggressions seem to be like an information shortcut, like gone awry. So do you think that it is malicious, and how do you take a step back and like find out if you are doing microaggressions?
That's a great question. Truman, you want that one or you?
Sure. Actually, in terms of microaggressions, I feel like multicultural competence is not necessarily as important as cultural humility in that context. So what I mean by that is cultural humility is the concept that it's basically saying that your culture is not the most superior culture, right? Mm-hmm. So you're looking at someone else and saying, okay, look, both of our perspectives are different, but they're both equally valuable. Kind of with microaggressions, what that allows you to do is step back and say, okay, did I say something to offend this person? And, if I did, even if I'm not noticing that I'm offending this person, am I able to put aside my own feelings of superiority and be humble, essentially, and ask for forgiveness in that context? So you repair microaggressions by removing this own sense of superiority of your own culture. What that, to me, means at least, is kind of the difference between racism and prejudice, right? So what we know is that racism is something that's mostly defined by a point of privilege or a point of power differential, whereas prejudice is just a preference for, I guess, one race, one group over the other, right? That's why, from what we understand, people in a position of privilege, or white males, for example, can be racist, whereas a black male or something similar, or a black female could not be, which is why microaggressions are generally committed by the majority culture. Kind of in that tangent, you need to kind of remove yourself from this feeling of superiority in order to repair the damage done by microaggression.
And if I could add, it's really important that we talk about this because 65% of students of color on college campuses report experiencing regular microaggressions. And here's the sad part, Anthony and Stephanie, those microaggressions are committed equally by their classmates and their professors. So there's things we're doing that are really missing the boat when we're trying to connect with people of color and also women and also LGBTQ people, right? This is all marginalized groups are affected by microaggressions.
For me, the microaggression that I faced was a lot of people ask me where I play basketball. Where do I play basketball? Because I'm a 6'4" black male. So a lot of people ask, like, where do you play basketball? Or where do you play football? When, like, I haven't played sports since, like, high school. So, like, can you give a concrete, like, example of what microaggressions, like, really jump out at you?
Well, one that I've experienced, as a black male in a graduate program, is you're so well spoken, or you talk white, or something similar to that. That is, I guess you got to look at the meaning behind the statement. because what that's saying is that black males in general are, dumb, deviant, and dangerous. That essentially there's no way that I, as a black male, can get into graduate school, maintain my grades, maintain my way of speaking without being white in some way. It's essentially burying black culture to replace it with white culture. The correct way of looking at this from my perspective would be speak white. Because I am black, so I speak like I speak, so that is a black way of speaking. A good way of figuring out whether or not something is a microaggression is to look at the context behind what they're saying, look at, what it implies, essentially.
And if I could add, Anthony, your example about basketball and being a 6'4" black guy, that's a great example of a microaggression. And one of the most common ones that people do all the time, especially white people like me, right, is color blindness. Say things like, "Oh, I don't see color. The best person should get the job." Well, I understand what's coming from that colorblind perspective, but the truth is there's two problems with color blindness, right? Or three problems, probably 40 problems. But anyway, to be short, one is that people who profess to be colorblind commit more microaggression than people who don't. Okay, so that's a problem, right? Mm-hmm. Two is that colorblindness just serves to maintain the current status quo, right? And we know the status quo is not even, right? We know it's like life is a tipped soccer field, and one team is always playing on the low part of the field. And so colorblindness just serves to keep the inequality that's current in society. And the third and final big problem is that colorblindness disallows a person's whole experiences, lived experiences, their color, their culture, their story, their history. And when we say we're colorblind, we don't allow for things like the impact of slavery or the impact of genocide on Native people or the ongoing ridicule and bullying and violence that LGBTQ people of all those marginalized groups actually face. So we really disallow people's lived experiences when we profess to be colorblind.
That makes sense. It's kind of like to choose to do the colorblind perspective is like pushing away the uncomfortable stuff.
Right on. And here's the problem, too. So white people hate to talk about race, but so do people of color, right? So white people hate to talk about it because we're afraid that people are going to see us as racist. Yeah. And so we've been like a pretzel to get out of a talk about race because we don't want to come across as being racist. And so a lot of times even people say stuff like, well, I'm not a racist, but. And you're like, oh, what's coming next? It's not going to be good, right? But also people of color don't like to talk about race either.
Yeah, and, mostly it's because we have to talk about it so much anyway, and it gets exhausting, but also we see so many reminders of, the traumatic past and the traumatic, present essentially of our country. This is something that we're constantly experiencing, whether or not that's through social media or just walking down the street or experiencing microaggressions really anywhere. It's an exhausting process. And so, what you generally see, as a result of these microaggressions and these daily indignities, that people of color and people of marginalized backgrounds go through, the research says that it's a lack of sleep, depression, anxiety, performance issues, things like that. So it is actually a problem that's measurable, and it's a problem that the research, points to, essentially.
So in other words, people who are subject to more microaggressions have higher stress, have higher depression, have higher anxiety. They can't concentrate as much in their class. So think about this for a minute. If 65% of people of color are regularly experiencing microaggressions in their class, what is that doing to their motivation to participate in that class? Mm-hmm. What is that doing to their concentration in that class? What is that doing to the GPAs in that class? Because if you're constantly wondering about when that next death by 1,000 paper cut is coming, then it's you're geared up to be ready to defend yourself instead of focusing on the subject matter.
So I understand that institutional racism is a real thing, and one study that popped out at me was they showed a white hand and a black hand holding an iPhone, and the black hand that was holding the iPhone was significantly less likely to sell the iPhone when they were placed on eBay. So just of the prejudices that people do have, how do they escape it? Like, what is the cure for this? Is it education? Is it just being exposed? Is it increasing social capital? Like, what do you do?
I think a big thing really the first step to this, right? We've got to recognize our own racism, and a key to that is recognizing our own privilege, right? So everybody's a complicated mix of some things we're privileged about and some things we're oppressed about, right? Nobody's like 100% privileged and nobody's 100% oppressed, right? So I have white skin, so I'm privileged for that. But hey, Stephanie, let me connect with you for a minute. Do you and I have 10,000 stories about what it means to be a woman and how we're treated as a woman?
Yeah.
Yeah, we could go on for days, right? Now.
Well, so like, and in terms of like, we actually had this conversation a couple of days ago. As a black male, I do have, well, of course, aspects of oppression and aspects of privilege as a male, you see, but then the black half of me, it's just like there's oppression as well. And, there are different contexts where like DeDe as a white woman and myself as a black male may benefit or not benefit. But the thing is, the point is that privilege and oppression are kind of like it's almost like a balancing act, right? With every level of privilege, there is also a level of oppression corresponding to that.
Like if I could add to what Truman said, they're like two sides of a teeter-totter, right? And so everybody's like, oh yeah, we're for social justice. Oh, social justice, yeah, right on. Like, yes, let's go march. Okay. Well, the first step to social justice is you got to recognize how you're privileged, right? And you got to recognize how that privilege keeps other people oppressed and other people down. But nobody wants to admit their own privilege, right? Nobody wants to admit white privilege, male privilege, heterosexual privilege, able-bodied privilege. They don't want to admit their own privilege. And I get that, right? We don't want to see that we benefit at someone else's expense. But truly working towards social justice, the first step has to be to recognize how you are privileged.
So you're balancing not only your privilege and your oppression that you deal with, but you also need to balance your personal accountability and your awareness of where you stand in society as well.
Right, and what we talk about when we talk with students, Truman and I talk about, we ask people about their grandparents, right? We say, hey, are your grandparents just a tad bit racist, or just a tad bit, heterosexist? And usually people chuckle like you did, and then they say, oh gosh, don't get me going, right? And then we ask them, hey, is it possible that a little bit of those ideas somehow got embedded into you, somehow imprinted on you? And usually when you ask people that, they can start to see like, holy crap, yeah, there's so many ways that because I live in this racist and sexist and heterosexist society, I believe these things. That it's like the black hand, white hand thing with the iPod, right? You don't even know. You don't even know that you're discriminating against. Identical job experiences, people still pick the supposed white person to hire. Same thing with professors. Identical resumes, people still pick professors still pick the male, and they still pick the person with the white-sounding name to be their lab assistant. So this is current data that these things are still going on, that our society is still very biased.
So if we look at the tide of history in regards to racism, bigotry, prejudice in general, like, do you think that this fight is being won? Like, if we were to look at the progress we've made in the last 10 years, 20 years, 40 years, like, do you think that it is much better now? I mean, we're having conversations about microaggressions versus like the lynching that happened last weekend. Like, do you think that we're winning essentially? Like, is it getting much better, our situation as a minority?
I think that with the advent of social media, I think it's more out there, and so I think that more people are seeing that it's happening. But I think that awareness of these things could be considered some type of progress. But I don't want to. I want you to take that with a grain of salt, because it's still happening, and that's the case in the point. That racism is still very much alive in this country, whether or not that's old-fashioned racism, or covert microaggressions or what have you. But we still have a long way to go.
And to add to that, we talked about microaggressions. Well, 44% of students of color regularly experience racism, flat-out racism on college campuses, okay? So that's a lot of folks still daily in contact with racism. And we know racism cuts across educational racism. We can give you so many examples. Financial racism, legal racism, housing racism. It doesn't matter what aspect of our society we look at. There's so much institutional racism. So, I mean, to me, I guess I want to be balanced with this too, like Truman is. Do I think we're winning? Holy cripes, I think we have a long way to go. And I don't even want to say that we're winning, especially in the current political climate. It's really difficult to claim any kind of victory except a hollow victory. But do I feel it's better than 40 years ago? Absolutely better than 40 years ago. Maybe not better than 1 year ago today, but we'll leave that alone. But do I feel hopeful that it will change the future? You know what? I do, Anthony and Stephanie. I feel like, I want to be on the right side of history, want to fight for these things. And so I'm going to believe that we can work towards a society that's just and fair to all people.
What is the fix? Like the overall, like, do you think that it'll get better with economic development in minority communities? Or do you think that by it being exposed in social media and in just the media in general, and having people be more educated and sensitive to the culture of minorities, do you think that the situation of microaggressions and prejudice in America will get better over time?
I think a key has to be, we have to get out of our bubbles, man. Like, look at our neighborhoods, look at our churches. We're still so segregated, right? And we have to build relationships with people that are other than us. And the research is really clear that the more differences a culture has with you, the more likely you are to reject people from that culture. And the dumb thing is, we reject people because of food they eat, clothes they wear, houses they live in, all those kind of things. If they're different from us, we have trouble connecting with them. And so we reject people who are Muslim because their dress is different, We reject people who are whatever, just because they're different than us, right? And so what we need to do is build relationships, because the truth is, people get better one by one, right? You know what I mean? You start to realize, wow, so I met one gay person, and that person I like. Okay, well, that helps, right? That does help, because that convinces you, like, maybe not all gay people are bad.
Yeah.
Or I met one black person, and hey, he's all right. Those are starting points, and so we really need to have those cross-cultural relationships, but our society doesn't set them up. We have to seek them out, right? We have to go out of our boxes and go to people who are different than us. And that's hard for people. That takes courage, right? It's so much easier to just stay with what you know.
So how do we encourage, especially in education, how do we encourage people to break out of that bubble? And what do you think of culturally responsive classrooms? How do you get people to break out of their bubble? Like, so for me, we, on this podcast, for the very first time, like, I want to say, what was it, 3 days ago? It was the first conversation I'd ever had with a person in transition. It was a transsexual woman. And it was the first conversation I actually had with them. So just in general, in speaking to minorities or breaking out of your own bubble, like how would you do it? Like, how do you get people to break out of their own bubble? Because just to double down on that, you can walk into any high school in America right now, and you will literally see the cafeteria broken down by race.
Right on.
So how do you get people to branch out, essentially?
Yeah.
I think one of the keys has to be the people in charge, if you will, right? Our leaders, whether that be, so in a classroom, that's going to be, the teacher sets the tone for that, right? So, of course, all the black kids are going to sit together in the cafeteria. All the white kids are going to sit together. All the Muslim kids are going to sit together. All the Latino kids are going to sit together, right? So what we want to do is have a culture that changes that, and that has to start with leaders. So the minute that the teacher does something different or requires something different or sets up a different social environment where people kind of are forced to build those cross-cultural relationships, that helps tremendously. It also helps tremendously when teachers are aware of their own racism and can admit their own racism. And, we got 78% of college professors are white, even as of 2015. So white people have a lot of work to do. And so being able to admit your own racism and see your own microaggressions is a really, really good start. And being able to say that in a classroom, right? Like, to say in a classroom, how much courage this thing. Think about this for a second. To be a professor and say, look, I'm a recovering racist. I'm trying not to say things that are stupid, but sometimes I do. I need your help to call me out when I say something stupid. I need you to have the courage to come tell me that I've said something stupid and help me see why it was stupid. That's what we need for people, is people to be able to admit their mistakes instead of pretending like we know it all. Because pretending like we know it all doesn't get us far. And pretending like we're not racist and we're not sexist, it doesn't get us very far, right? That doesn't work to just, let's sing Kumbaya and everybody's fine. You have to start with admitting your own biases.
I think that it's also important to recognize that these are not going to be, easy discussions,
Right.
And that there are going to be some emotional reactions. Generally, in this society, in this heterosexist white society, essentially, everything we talk about has to have some level of control or whatever, some level of cold empiricism, where like you can't show emotion in conversations, or everything that you say past that point is perceived as invalid. However, we have to understand that having difficult conversations about race, about sex, about gender, about all these types of things, they're going to bring up feelings in all of us. So I think that it brings this responsibility upon the professor or the teacher, to be able to manage those feelings within themselves.
If I could add an example of, when professors try to bring up race in their classroom, let's think about what happens, right? First of all, the women are like, I don't know why we're talking about race. Let me talk about how discriminated I am as a woman. And that's true. That's obviously true. But it does protect people from talking about race sometimes, right? And then what happens is people tend to get upset, especially people of color, right? Because it's really difficult to talk about racism, especially in a racist society, especially when some of your classmates are racist, right? So we get this terrible dynamic where it can be really emotionally draining for our people of color. So sometimes what happens with people of color is it gets overwhelming. They want to make their point. They're frustrated. They're emotional. And then what happens is you get the white women crying in the classroom, right? And then, we better table this discussion. This is too emotional. We can't have this in our classroom. This isn't okay. And it's like, wait a minute. What just happened right there? Like 10,000 things happened wrong, right? Because we're going to have those honest conversations about race. And that's going to mean that it's going to be hard and that there's going to be some tears and that it's going to be difficult sometimes. But that doesn't let us off the hook to not encourage people to learn, right? Our job as professors, our job is to help students learn. Our job as any kind of leaders of society, we can't stay where we are. We have to push people ahead to become something better. And it's so important then to push them to say, okay, how can we make this better? How can you fix the racism in you so we can move ahead instead of tabling the discussion? Tabling the discussion doesn't help.
So with the conversation being as difficult as it is, there's been increased talk about safe spaces on college campuses. And one of the things that there's been a giant pushback on have been conservatives trying to speak on college campuses. People who are purposefully inflammatory, people like Ann Coulter and Ben Shapiro. So what do you stand on people not being able to speak on college campuses and the restriction of what some would consider a highly insensitive speech at the very least?
I got to say, there's a difference between freedom of speech and hate speech, right? Mm-hmm. And if an individual's just espousing hate speech, which is what a lot of those folks do, then why are we giving them, it's like oxygen for a fire. Why would you give oxygen to a fire as someone who's just about hate speech? That's not a learning environment. That's not listening to both sides. That's just hate speech. So it's fine to entertain views different than yours. It's fine to have those robust dialogues, but that invitation to speak shouldn't extend to people who are just filled with hate.
And to follow up on that, I feel like a lot of the things that people like Richard Spencer or Milo Yiannopoulos or someone like that, that they're bringing to the table is essentially just a call to action, more or less. Something that's convincing people, to go and engage in some type of violence against people of color or people with differences. So I don't think that's, like DeDe was saying, freedom of speech. I feel that that's actually something that's dangerous and counterproductive, really. And
Abraham Lincoln said, "Your right to swing your arm ends where my nose begins." And the problem I feel like with some of those things that Truman's talking about is it's contact. It's a physical hit. It extends past your right to swing your arm into you have made contact with another human being through your words. And those words are so hurtful and so hateful that it's no longer your right to speak when it's hatred, language of hatred.
That's fair. So this last question, and then I'll let you go. After the Trump election, do you feel that the political climate and the prejudice in America has gotten worse, or do you think that it's just been exposed?
I think there's good evidence to say it's gotten worse. I think when we look at measured racism against hate crimes have gone up, and a number of other data has said it is. I think whether people are Latinx or Black or LGBTQ, there's been an eroding of some initiatives that have served to try to make things better for marginalized groups. So I can't see any way that we're going forward. I do hear what you're saying. There's this tiny little silver lining, and maybe it's white privilege that allows me to see this tiny silver lining of at least we're having conversations about race, at least we're talking about it. But that's a tiny little one plus in the midst of horrific, dangerous policies that are really damaging to people of color and LGBTQ people. So I can't say that one good thing outweighs all the negative things of the current administration. Truman, you have a
on the other hand, I feel that yes, things have gotten worse, because if you look at some of the policies that Trump has tried to pass and all this type of stuff, some of the things that he's been suggesting, from a level of a political climate, things have changed a lot, gotten a lot worse. But I think that also the way that he speaks, the way that he talks to Americans, it's galvanized. I feel racist, sexist, all of these other individuals, to voice their opinions and to actually engage in violence. I feel that what we've seen in Charlottesville, with the acts of terror, in churches and in Las Vegas and all of those types of places, I think that this idea that these individuals are not engaging in acts of terror, because they're white and not Muslim or something similar. I think that's something that may be an effect of Trump's rise to power. Things have gotten worse, I feel.
And it's all, the first thought we had is it's a terrible tragedy that happened yesterday in Texas, right? Mm-hmm. With San Antonio, with the shooting of the church of 26, 28 people now dead. And that's horrifically tragic. And one of our first thoughts that Truman and I had yesterday was, please, God, don't let it be a Black man or a Muslim or a Latina man that did the shooting. That was one of our very first thoughts, because then it just serves to reinforce and underline that narrative that's so common right now of other people do the shooting. Other people are dangerous. We must protect ourselves and arm ourselves. But the truth is that we are our own worst enemies. We have to protect ourselves against ourselves, right? We have lots of problems in terms of access to guns and lack of mental health in this country. But it doesn't do us any good to just disparage an entire group, because of isolated acts of aggression. Yeah. And it's really problematic when the first thought you had after a national tragedy such as Las Vegas or such as Texas is, I hope it was a white man who killed people. Like, how sad is that's where we are as a society? It's
almost, I hate to say this, but it was almost a breath of relief for us. At this table, we've got a Hispanic female, a Black male, and we're both Muslim. So, when...
Right on. I hear exactly what you're saying. And our first thought is, please don't let it be a marginalized group.
Yeah, because at least this way, it's just like, God, that guy may have had his own issues. Like, we look at the Las Vegas shooter as an individual. Like, he had his own deal. Like, whatever was going on to make him do what he did, it was his thing. It wasn't because he's one of a group of people.
Right, and you saw the narrative right after that shooting, right? The first thing that the press came out and said, it was a lone wolf. It was a lone wolf.
Yeah.
This white guy does not represent us. And it's like, what the heck? You would not extend that privilege of the lone wolf kind of thinking to a person who was Black or a person who was Muslim or a person that was Latinx. Your first thought would be, to outlaw them people from our country. It's dangerous kind of thinking, right? Every ethnic group in the world has people do stupid things in it, right? There's no ethnic group that has a more idiots per capita than another group, right? We all have these people who are embarrassing and full of hate and poor thinkers. But that's not culturally determined, right? Mm-hmm. Like, that's not the province of Muslims or the province of Black people or the province of white people to have these scary people among them. All groups have them.
100%. So, just to touch bases on that particular phenomenon, we had that literal discussion. Like, I want to say it was not the Vegas shooter, but one of the shooters. Like, we heard about it, and our literal reaction, the first thing he says, "Oh God, please don't be Muslim. Please don't be Muslim. Please don't be Muslim. Please don't be." And it turned out that particular one, the one that ran over
it was
the people.
in New York, right?
In New York, that's one. So the one in New York, it was like, please don't be Muslim, please don't. And it turned out it was a Muslim. And to which the conversation immediately steered toward, ISIS is a Muslim fundamentalist. It was, and then you had people like Ben Shapiro and many conservatives in their particular media outlet were saying that this is what Islam is. So it was, I don't know. I guess my question to you, and this is the last question. I'll make this the last question. Is like, why do you think that narrative shifts so quickly? Where it's like, if it is a white male, it's a lone wolf. He was mentally disturbed. Let's start talking about the nuance, and like, let's keep gun legislation off the table. But let's start talking about the nuance. But if it is a brown person, it's like, oh, is he affiliated with ISIS? Is this? We believe that he's affiliated with ISIS, and then it's like that's the first thing that comes out. Why is that?
Because we want to believe we're safe, man. We want to believe that we live in this environment that's safe, right? And so we want to believe that it's the other people who can perpetuate kind of violence. But the truth is, for example, where's a woman most dangerous? Where's a woman most likely to get killed? It's the man she sleeps with, is the most dangerous person of all. Where is a child most likely to be sexually abused? It's his or her parents, right? So when we have this false narrative about where danger comes from. Danger comes from the people who are closest to us. Danger comes from your neighbor, you know. Danger doesn't come from these people outside of you. Danger comes from all around, right? And people don't want to believe that, and they want to believe that the other people are responsible for the violence, and that's just not true.
We want to be able to believe that we can predict something, you know, that we'll be able to predict when the danger comes and who it comes from. But generally, if we do want to predict that, we need to start looking at domestic terrorism rather than external sources of terror.
I imagine that's just more difficult to do, and the narrative is just easy. It's easier to paint it in a certain light. Like it, I mean, if the culture in the media is if it bleeds, it leads, then of course you're going to get violence first, and then if we have to wrap this up into a tidy narrative or one that fits a specific political agenda, then all right, well then we'll go with the simplest one, and that happens to be the simplest. So.
And kudos to you and your show because you're pushing people past sound bites, right? So your listeners out there, this is not soundbite information, right? You can't just walk away from this with a short, like, easy, pat answer. And your show helps people to really have a thoughtful understanding of some really complex issues, and that's what we need to do to move ahead, right? Those are key things to help people moving ahead. We have to inform people with real facts and have real conversations like you're doing on your show.
Well, cheers. I hope the show works out.
Me too.
Cheers. Well, I appreciate it, DeDe Wohlfarth and Truman Harris. I appreciate it.
Y'all have been great. Thank you very
so
much.
Awesome. Thanks for sitting with us.
Y'all have a
Cheers.
great one.
Okay,
All right,
goodbye.
thanks.
That was awesome.
It's nice to have. It's like a breath of fresh air when you get two educated people that are just regular Joes, but they're out there. The scary thing to think about is that everybody's just running around ignorant and hating on each other. But the reality is that there are people that are that have their eyes open and they're
conscious.
Yeah, they're not only conscious about it, they're like gentle and conscious. The social justice warriors, is that what we call them? Like honestly, like I've met up and I've spoke with a few of those people who are out for a cause, and that's great. It gets a little aggressive sometimes, and it's like I'm not the bad guy. Like I want to hear you. I want to hear what you have to say.
So
like,
the problem is
let's
that
talk.
Just like with any other movement, the social justice warrior can be too aggressive. These particular ones seem perfectly fine, but like just like you can get a crazy person in a right wing position, it's like, oh man, this guy just he threw a Molotov cocktail through the window. You could also get a social justice warrior that's kind of a jerk, as a crazy person. These ones seem
because we're all
awesome,
people.
But
absolutely, I got a lot of good information.
Okay, so hold on, pause one sec. I have a dog and a cat, and I just got a new dog, and my new dog is now checking out my cat. And they're both moving.
He's half the size of the cat, by the way.
Yeah, they're both moving incredibly slowly, and they're freaking me out. I don't know what this interaction is going to be like. I think this is the first time they've met.
No, Gizmo's been trying to chase the cat.
Oh, this is going to be bad.
Get him, Gizmo.
Anyway, all right. So I think that's it. I think we're done here. We're done.
I'm gonna play with the dog. All right,
thanks for listening to PolyPsych podcast.
As always.
Go to polypsych.org and register on the site for a free membership, and we can talk to you one-on-one about literally any topic. So today's one was on essentially social justice, I guess, and just prejudices and the things that we hold, and we're not really sure why we hold those things. So we have that was today's show. Yesterday's show was on trans women, and we've got another 20 shows or so in the pipe. So literally, if you want to be interviewed, where we could talk about anything, including paintings. I'm really into art. All of a sudden, art and food,
animal behavior. We got any animal behaviorists?
That'd be dope. Anyway, so go to PolyPsych.org, sign in, do a profile and everything. I'll get your email. That way we can converse back and forth, and then
come nerd out with us.
Yeah. All right. So I guess that's
Later.
it. Bye.
Good show, old chap. Good show.
Cheers, mate.